Hi, Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and continuing the Silmarillion Synopsis series, we're now getting to Quintus Silmarillion Chapter 18 of the Ruin of Beleriand and the Fall of Fingolfin. This chapter basically details how Morgoth finally breaks the siege of Angband and makes life pretty miserable for a lot of people, and it's the beginning of a long downhill slide, so let's get started on finding out what happens. Now, of course, in the previous chapter, we saw men come into the West and how the elves kind of took them in, tried to make friends and allies of them. Some of the men weren't really into that. They decided they weren't going to stick around and fight in a war that they weren't too really involved with. 6 generations after men come into Beleriand and 455 years after the Noldor have returned to Middle-earth, Fingolfin takes it into his head that because of the added strength of men, they might actually be able to attack Morgoth successfully. Unfortunately, none of the other elves are really into that idea because they're all kind of happy with their settled life at this point. The only other elves that are kind of on his side are the brothers of Finrod, Ignor and Angrod, who are in the north in Dorthonion, which is where the people of Beor live. And that's basically because they're looking kind of across the plain at Angband, and they are constantly aware of the threat of Morgoth, and so they're like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, but nobody else is, and so nothing really comes of his planning. We get a moonless night where Morgoth suddenly unleashes a surprise attack. And kind of the first aspect of this is not even an army. He has a bunch of molten lava or fire or something that comes out of the towers of the Thangorodrim and basically totally wipes out the green plain of Ardgallen, which is the vast green plain that was kind of in between his, fortress and everything to the south. And it burns up that entire plain and doesn't, it just ruins it and turns it into a really nasty area called the Unfauglith. So it starts off the battle, which is known as the Dagor Bragollach, and that is the Battle of the Sudden Flame, appropriately enough. And a lot of elves and men actually die in this initial burning because they just can't escape fast enough. But of course, it's stopped by many of the mountains in the north of Middle-earth, and it doesn't wipe out everybody for that reason. The Dagor Bragollach proper lasts until the spring that follows this winter assault, but it tells us that war never really ceases after this, and so there's just constant incursions and battles and things, although we will find out later that there's some let up in the overall assault, but when Morgoth kind of runs out of steam. But the main point here is because of this really massive fire wave that comes out and kills a lot of people, and the fumes from that, it renders a lot of confusion on the side of the elves and men, and the huge number of Balrogs and orcs that come out are able to really tear them apart, and they make a kind of a wedge between Fingolfin in the west and the Sons of Feanor and others, Agnor and Angrod being the main example, in the east. And because of this, a lot of people are unable to come to each other's aid. There's not really a lot going on. And of course, Morgoth sends a separate army in the east to attack Maedhros on the hill of Himring. Now you've got all this going on kind of at the same time, and at first the elves are just completely overwhelmed because of the massive assault. And Ignor and Angrod both die. The current leader of the Beor, people of Beor, dies, and Barahir becomes the leader of them, but most of his people die. And in the end of this assault, there's just not many of his people left, but they never really leave Dorthonion. They just kind of become outlaws, and we'll see a little bit more of that later. Lots of people die in this assault, and Finrod himself is actually in the north fighting, and he barely escapes, and only because Barahir comes up with a fairly large contingent and fights the orcs that are pursuing him and says, get out of here now while you can. Finrod Felagund basically says, thank you, and because you've done this for me, I will pledge my aid to you and your kin in any need. And he gives him his ring, which of course later becomes known as the Ring of Barahir, even though it's technically the Ring of Finrod, as a token of this pledge. And of course this will become very important later on, so keep your eye out for that. It'll be the very next chapter, in fact. So there's a lot of disaster right up front in this battle. One of the other interesting things that happens in this battle, Glaurung, who you may remember came out kind of too early in an earlier battle, is now full grown, and he's one of the foremost of Morgoth's forces. And thanks to him also, it's very easy to wipe out a lot of people. Maedhros and Moglor kind of hold out in the east on the Hill of Himring, but the other sons of Feanor are really kind of pushed out because they don't have any good fortified places to the east. The Hill of Himring is really the only spot that they can hold out. And so the Celegorm and Curufin, these two other sons of Feanor, they end up retreating to Nargothrond and to live with Finrod because they were kind of buddies beforehand. A lot of the Sindar end up just trying to go to Doriath and are admitted by Thingol. And during this time also, Fingolfin is basically barely holding on to the realm of Hithlum because the mountains there provide a lot of natural defense. So he's holding out, and Maedhros is holding out, but the rest of them are all being pushed back or otherwise just killed. Seeing all this, and after some time passes and Fingolfin realizes what's gone on in other parts of Beleriand, he realizes that the sons of Feanor are basically all driven out. Caranthir and Amrod and Amras both have all kind of gone south to be with the Green Elves, and the Finrod and his brothers are basically not doing that well. Orodreth is kind of holding out in the north in the Tower of Minas Tirith, but even that will fall eventually. Fingolfin, seeing all this, is just kind of in a state of rage and despair, and so by himself he takes his horse and he rides all the way up to the gates of Angband, and nobody even stands in his way because he is so rage-induced that nobody's willing to stand in front of him. He goes up to the gates, and like he did whenever he first came back to Middle-earth, I should say, he bangs on the doors, but this time he's basically challenging Morgoth to single combat, calling him a coward, a lord of slaves, and all this, and it tells us that Morgoth, not really being able to do otherwise because he would really lose face, actually does come out to face Fingolfin in single combat. Now, Morgoth is carrying this huge hammer called Grond. You may recognize that from the huge battering ram that they use in the Lord of the Rings to break the gates of Minas Tirith. He brings out this huge hammer and shield, and of course he's just big because he's of Valar, I should say. Fingolfin has his sword and his shield, and Morgoth is basically just trying to crush him with his mace, just swinging at him, and Fingolfin has to dodge, otherwise he's just going to be crushed to the ground. And Morgoth, because of his power, is filling the ground with pits. And Fingolfin keeps dodging, and eventually, he's also in the middle of all this, giving Morgoth various wounds in places. And eventually, though, Fingolfin is getting tired of having to dodge all over the place, and Morgoth just starts trying to push him around with his shield. And Fingolfin manages to get back up 3 times, but in the process of all this, he finally just ends up in a spot where he's right next to a pit, and he falls backward because there's just no flat ground left. Morgoth takes his foot and puts it on Fingolfin's neck, and he starts crushing him, and Fingolfin basically with his last chance pulls out his, I don't know if it was sword or his knife, but he basically hacks at the left foot of Morgoth, which is on his neck. And it tells us that forever after that, Morgoth goes lame because of that wound, but he does crush Fingolfin. And he also breaks Fingolfin's body, and he's about to throw it to his wolves when Thorondor, the king of the eagles, comes, swoops down, claws Morgoth's face, and takes the body of Fingolfin to the encircling mountains around Gondolin. And there, Turgon, who is the son of Fingolfin, comes up and builds a tomb basically for Fingolfin in the mountains, and it tells us that it remains basically inviolate until I don't want to spoil too much, but the Silmarillion itself spoils it, so until later when Gondolin itself will fall. So it's like many tombs of good guys, you'll find out it is either imbued with some kind of magical property or at least is perceived as such. So that is the fall of Fingolfin. Fingolfin, one of the most well-beloved of all the elf princes, just goes out and challenges Morgoth and manages to do quite a bit, but he can't defeat Morgoth and eventually is killed. After all this happens, Fingon, the other son of Fingolfin who lives with him in Hithlum, he sends his son Eärenion down to the havens with Círdan, the shipwright. Eärenion also is known as Gil-galad, so that's a significant name as well that you might be familiar with from the Lord of the Rings stories. Also in this time period, we get, as I mentioned earlier, the people of Beor are basically very, very dwindled. There's not many of them left because they were kind of up north where the first assault was, and so many of them were killed. Barahir leads a very small group. He basically sends his wife and other women across the mountains to try to get, somewhere safer. And among them are two women that we will meet later, Morwen and Rion, and we'll find out about them later. But they move across and move to Brethil at first, and we'll find out what happens to them a bit later. But in the meantime, Barahir is still holding out in Dorthonion, not as a, in a fortified place or anything like that, but basically living as outlaws. And it tells us that the whole region is kind of turned into a really nasty, dark magic type place that even the orcs won't go unless they absolutely have to. But the men of Barahir are still there living as outlaws, contesting the orcs as much as they can. So Morwen and Rion basically at a later point leave Brethil along with several others and move to Dorloman, which is where the people of Marach, you may remember, who are led by at this point Hador, where they're living. So they will become significant later because Morwen ends up marrying Húrin, and Rion ends up marrying Huor, who are sons of Hador, and therefore they're kind of next up in line for the lordship of men in that region, and they will become significant also because of the people who descend from those families. As I mentioned earlier, the Tower of Minas Tirith, which was up in the River Sirion, Orodreth holds that for some while, about 2 years it tells us, even after the initial assault. But finally Sauron, who is one of Morgoth's he's Morgoth's greatest, servant, comes, and the dread that he brings with him is just too much, and Orodreth just has to flee. So Sauron takes the island, and it becomes known as the Tol Ingaurhoth, as opposed to the Tol Sirion, which basically means Island of Werewolves. And he turns it into a really nasty place, as you can imagine. So after all this, Morgoth is basically taking fortresses one by one, trying to capture as many of the different places as he can, and he's pursuing his enemies over time, but the main assault ended much earlier, and he's taking prisoners, and this becomes significant because many of the Noldor that become prisoners, or other elves that become prisoners, he has a way of basically making them slaves to his will, so he may release them at some point, seeming to be just kind of magnanimous, but they end up being traitors and things like that, so they can't really be trusted. And because of this, people who actually legitimately escape are shunned, even as if they had, as if they had been released by Morgoth, because everybody's like, well, I don't know, he could be lying, could be one of Morgoth's tricks. He's also spending a lot of time trying to promise men, rewards and things if they will side with him instead of the elves. But of course, the three houses of the Edain are having none of that. But around this time, there are other men coming in from the east in two different families, that some of whom are already allies with Morgoth and some of whom are not. And this will become significant later on, but Maedhros makes an alliance with these two different houses of men that come across, and the two houses are led by Bor and Ulfang, and they'll become significant in the next major battle, but that'll be a couple chapters down. Now, the men of the people of Haleth who were living in Brethil, as I mentioned earlier, they are now having to contend with a bunch of orcs, whereas they had never really had to much before, other than when they were back in the east. And they have the help of some of Thingol's people, and they crush an orc host. But at this time, Húrin and Huor, who are like in their early teens, they're pretty young. They were being raised over there because it was kind of the custom of men at the time to have their sons, sired by other relatives. So at this point, they're with them, and they actually go to the battle, even though they're really young, but they're separated from the main group, and as a result, they kind of get lost. And you have to remember, of course, this is kind of partially because there's a fog that comes up. This is the River Syrian, so I mean it's kind of a thing, but you get the idea. Maybe Ulmo's involved too. But they wander around and they end up near the encircling mountains, and they don't know where the heck they are. But the eagles come and they actually pick them up and bring them into Gondolin, and there they meet Turgon, of course. Turgon has had messages from means we don't really know exactly how, from Ulmo, that he should be very kind to the people of the House of Hodor, because through them will come aid to him later on. So he is, very willing to take them on and be nice to them. Húrin and Huor, after a while staying there, basically say, look, you can sit in Gondolin forever because you're an elf and you're immortal. We are going to die eventually. We want to go back to, our people so that we have a chance to fight before it's too late. And he basically says, well, I have a law against people leaving that. And Húrin and Huor basically tell him, well, we didn't actually see how we got here. We don't even know where we are, really. They have a vague sense of where they are, but they don't really know where they are because we were carried here by eagles and there was a huge mist that kind of blocked our vision of most everything, so we don't really know where you are, so we can't give it away. And they also swear oaths basically saying, we'll never tell anybody. And so he's like, okay, fine. Miglin, we get a mention of him, and he's basically says, man, the law's gotten kind of lax. It used to be a lot tougher around here, but that's kind of all we get from him. So the eagles take them both back out, and they eventually come back to Dorloman, which is where their people are. They don't go back to Brethil. And they're really well dressed and stuff because they've been, in the favor of the king, Turgon, and people are like, where have y'all been? And, they basically won't say anything about it, but because of the fact that they're well dressed and well fed, even though they've been gone for like a year, it tells us, people start to figure out they probably found Gondolin, and that's why they won't talk. And it tells us also that Morgoth kind of learns of this rumor, and because of that, he starts to pay a lot of attention to, these two individuals, and has plans for how he might use their knowledge to finally find out where Gondolin is. Speaking of Turgon, he had not allowed his people to leave Gondolin to join in the battle because he didn't think it was really the right time, and he thought that something later would be, there was going to be something later where he would really need to be part of that, and it wasn't time to reveal Gondolin yet. So he's still an unknown to Morgoth and basically everybody else. And it does tell us, though, that after all this stuff happens, because of the disaster, he starts to send people secretly down to the Havens and the Isle of Valar, way down in the south, to try to build ships and sail into the west to seek the aid of the Valar. But because Valinor was hidden, basically none of them make it, and very few even return. And so after a while, nothing really happens. Morgoth, however, hears about this, and he's not really happy about it because he's worried that eventually they will get aid from the Valar, and that might cause problems for him. He's also really worried just because he doesn't know where Turgon is. He has no clue where he disappeared to, and he's also worried about Finrod Felagund because he doesn't really know where he went. He knows of the name Nargothrond, but he doesn't know where it is or how strong it is, but he doesn't even know anything about Gondolin. He doesn't know the first thing about it. And so those two things really weigh on Morgoth's mind, even though he's had, this huge victory. However, it does also tell us that after a while, the elves kind of start to regroup and win back some of the territory that they lost, because as I mentioned earlier, Morgoth kind of runs out of steam, and he couldn't keep pushing forever. His power just wasn't quite that great yet. His armies weren't that large. He just didn't have quite enough to really push and destroy all of Beleriand yet. So, Morgoth recalls most of his orcs to Angband to kind of regroup himself, and 7 years after the Dagor Bragollach, he ends up sending another large army, specifically against Hithlum, to try to defeat Fingon and the men who were in Dorloman. And on the fortresses in the mountains, they're doing a lot of fighting, and Hodor, who is the Lord of the Men at that point, he ends up taking an arrow and dying, and so Húrin, who is still rather young, becomes the Lord of the Men of Dorloman. He ends up fighting off the orcs and becoming quite a really good leader. Fingon is actually in a precarious situation, though. He ends up kind of trapped by a huge orc host, but just in the nick of time, a bunch of ships come from Círdan in the south who help him defeat those orcs, and they drive them off. So Hithlum is still inviolate and remains pretty safe. And it's around this time, shortly after this, that Húrin ends up marrying Morwen, and Huor weds Rion. And as I mentioned, they will become very significant later. And that is basically how the huge assault of Morgoth ruins Beleriand, and Fingolfin manages to get himself killed in a valiant but basically doomed attempt to fight Morgoth single-handed. So that's pretty much the end of this chapter. A lot going on. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found that interesting. Please do share the video around and give it a thumbs up if you did enjoy it. You can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore, which I occasionally drop some trivia, Tolkien-related trivia questions there. You can also, of course, find the Silmarillion Synopsis series link in the description below. You can subscribe to the channel over here. You can patronize my channel over here. And you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, this is the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore Channel. Namaste.